Hi, history students. This is another video lecture, screencastify. If you prefer reading on your own, then you can just ignore this and not watch it. However, if you want my delightful commentary while going through the slides, then keep watching. You could probably go through the slides while listening to this in the background. Or you could watch me go through them with a little picture right down here. I can move it too. There we are. Now I'm at the top. Okay. Last week we talked about some destabilizers in history, historical arsonists, though that's not correct. This week we're going to talk about other destabilizers, in this case, plague. We're going to focus on the Black Death. And it kind of connects in a little bit to the destabilizer that we were discussing last week, which was last 2 weeks actually, which was the Mongols. So the Mongols actually have a role to play in the beginning of the Black Death because the Mongols essentially open up trade routes, streamline trade, and makes trade flow much more quickly. This allows the bubonic plague, the Black Death, although there is debate as to whether it was actually the bubonic plague. Very small debate because most people agree that yes, it was. But, historians like to nitpick over almost everything. Hence why I can't be convinced the words I'm saying are words. Anyways, the plague traveled to Europe rather quickly by virtue of the fact that the Mongols had opened up trade routes in their one giant empire. So that leads us toward a stabilizer, the Black Death. Okay, before talking about this, though, we need to talk about social order. Yes, we do? Yeah, there we are. There's the next slide. Social order before 1347. 1347 is the date that the Black Death is supposed to have appeared in Europe proper. Oh, I should have combed my hair beforehand. Anyways, so social order beforehand. This is something I obliquely talked about in one of the other PowerPoints, but it's something that we should probably discuss at least briefly. Feudalism. What is feudalism? Essentially, it's a political organization, not necessarily economic, though it can be as well. But it's a system of landowning that came into dominance in Western Europe when the central authority of the Roman Empire disappeared. Essentially, it was a system of organization that existed all the way up into the late medieval or high Middle Ages or into the early Renaissance. In fact, in Russia, some would debate that serfdom survived all the way up to 1861 or 62 when it was done away with by Alexander III, maybe. I think he was assassinated for that, among other things. Uh, Anyways, feudalism. This is a feudal pyramid. It's a very hierarchical organization, king at the top, knights at the bottom, and then below the knights holding all of this up are the actual serfs, the workers. So this system kind of emerged in the disorder after the fall of Rome, and it emerged in different ways in different parts of Europe. But most generally, what you had was people who had power, um, using that power to expand their power further. And those who didn't have power would usually pledge themselves to an individual who did have power. So if you say had a horse and some armor and you knew how to fight, you could perhaps join. In Britain, in the Anglo-Saxon realms, you could join a war party, or I have to pause because I can't remember what the word is. So in the Anglo-Saxon realms, feudalism looked like this. You'd essentially have a feudal lord, and that lord would have his wirod, which would be his war band, and his hearthwirod would be the highest individuals within the war band who would advise him. These later would have the titles of dukes. Right there, you can see dukes. Circled it. Highlight. There we are. actually, I can draw on this. Hold on. So these Hearthwyrod would be your dukes. Then below them, you would have aldermen. They later become your earls, and later those earls become on the continent. Those earls would be considered counts or barons, depending. Then you'd have various people below those, and essentially there was a responsibility both above and below. Now, this should sound somewhat familiar. It should sound kind of like the Confucian system of organization that was used in China, where you would have an individual who's at the top, in this case, the king. I'm gonna circle that one too because I can do that now. It's a snowman. Anyways, so you'd have the king at the top, and they would have a responsibility to their deity, to God, to maintain order, to maintain the mandate of heaven. That's the Chinese case. In Europe, it was more just to God. Um, and that king would set aside bookland, land for the church. And that's what it was called, bookland. And then the church would say, hey, you're doing your job, you're protecting and providing for the church. So that's the king's responsibility. To get that land, the king may have to go to war, may have to strategically marry, may have to trade, depending. Now, those below the king, they rely on the king for protection, for safety, uh, usually for promotions. Um, in the Anglo-Saxon realm, the king was the king, or Bretwalda was referred to as the giver of rings. So the king would provide you with this wealth and status, and then you would provide them with fighting ability. Counts would do the same for the dukes, barons, etc., all the way down to the knight. Um, uh, so the knight would essentially be your lowest level, which would be a dude and a horse. Essentially, if you're able to have that, you'd have a bit of a plot of land. Now, you would have a responsibility to raise perhaps some people to fight as like shock soldiers or cannon fodder, though this is before cannons, so sword fodder. Anyways, you would have the responsibility to kind of get some of those serfs or peasants and bring them with you, as with the barons, etc., etc. So knights. So it's essentially this system where everybody has a responsibility to those both above them and below them. So very similar to the Confucian system. So let's take a look at what these obligations look like on the PowerPoint. Yes. Okay. So for a knight, for instance, you would have your lord would have the obligation of protection. They might hear you in court if you've got a legal case that you need to deal with. And they're going to try to protect your family interests. This would be mainly looking out for protection of, say, succession, ensuring that the succession in your family is stable. You'd have military service as a response. You'd have to help with attendance and pay ransom. So that's essentially the obligations of a knight. Now, on top of the feudal system is an economic system that's the basis for the feudal system. That is manorialism. Basically, you have a country estate and manor, and these are this was like a patchwork collection of these estates that were essentially managed by lords or their serfs, usually and sometimes knights, and then those patchwork properties would have a certain rent to pay to a higher up, to a higher lord, a lord that's in charge of a particular region. And the rent would be paid in work by the serfs. So, what did the serfs have to do? Well, they were a family that was legally bound to a manor, to a lord. They had to provide services to the lord, but in return, they got a place to live, and protection was the big thing. Again, think about the chaos after Rome. No one's really in charge. Barbarians are spreading, also assimilating. So you've got competition for the land that you have as well. So you look to those who have power for protection. So that's how serfs kind of got into this situation. And unfortunately, it's something that you're subsequently born into. There were certain ways that the lords could keep the serfs in their control. through taxes, like they had to use, or through requiring serfs to use only the lord's equipment. So mills are a great example where if you lived on a particular estate, you had to use that estate's mill, and sometimes you'd have to pay a particular percentage of the grain that you're milling to that estate. So there were ways that the lords would extract as much from you as possible. Now look at this obligation list. The lord, they have to provide good government, justice, fair treatment, all of that. But in return, you've got all these obligations for the serf. It's a long list. So you'd have to bring firewood, so cartage. This is what they had to do: firewood for the manor, help in the harvest, work on the Lord's land. So 3 days a week you'd be working on the Lord's land, and the other four are yours. The corvée labor was something that existed all the way up into the Renaissance, where you have, even in France in like the time of Louis XIV, you still have some people in some regions doing corvée labor. So this was seen to be inefficient because you're using people who are unskilled for things like road repair rather than extracting taxes and having somebody who's actually good at road repair. It's part of the reason why French roads sucked in the Renaissance and afterwards, technical term. So you had to pay taxes like a marriage tax, a tax at Easter and Christmas. That's fun. So jolly. So fees, all these things you had to pay, and of course you had to do some court duty. So lots of obligations, but in return you did get a place to live on your lord's manor, and a small amount of protection. Okay, so that's the social order before the Black Death. Things change because Europe was its population was actually expanding quite rapidly, even with this horrible system. Um, and so, what happens with the Black Death is you had a huge population of people vying for a small number of jobs, which meant that the lords, the barons, all of these, the nobility, essentially could demand whatever they wanted because there was such a shortage of jobs and so many people vying for those jobs. So they could basically the nobles could demand whatever they wanted, and people would have to oblige because they need to live. The Black Death changes that because suddenly the workforce gets cut by some historians say a third, some historians say a half, because that's roughly how much the population goes down in Europe, by a third of the population of Europe, or by a half. So let's talk about the documentary. I put a documentary on the class website. Um, it's a video from the History Channel. It's good. It is incredibly heavy-handed. So here's my little. I wrote. You can read it. There's a disclaimer there. Normally, what I do is I just say this has some blood. It's unpleasant, and uh, it's a heavy-handed. And then I'd press play. I'd say leave if you need to, and I'd press play. However, with the coronavirus, things are a little bit more sensitive when it comes to topics like pandemics, of which the Black Death was. So this may hit closer to home. Having said that, the curriculum does emphasize the importance of non-human actors in history, things that cause great shifts in history that are climatically related, or in this case, related to a disease. So bacteria. Anyways, as a result, I think that it's incredibly important that we still study this. Watch the video if it makes you uncomfortable because of our sensitive situation right now globally. Then stop watching. However, I do think it's important because it does get at it does help us look at our current times with a bit of context, and it's important because uh, while the brutal effects of the Black Death uh, are shocking, that doesn't mean that those things will, the brutality will be repeated. Um, so it does provide a little bit of, for me, it provides a little bit of comfort that we're not going to go um, down the dark roads that people went down when the Black Death came, because we know more science. Okay, with that disclaimer in mind, here are the questions. You should watch it. Watch at least the first 30 minutes because it gets at how it spreads, the extent, and some recent, I say 2003, that's not super recent archaeological research, but it's research that's within this century. Okay. So watch it. If you want to go beyond 30 minutes, it's really good. It talks about the flagellant movement and how the Black Death and many pandemics typically kind of fizzle out. So it goes into that theory. So watch that. I'm not going to go into a great depth. Look, there's a map showing it spread. Okay. Societies. And there's a GIF for all of, no, it's a GIF for all of those people who love those. Okay, moving over here now. So a few things, a few ways society responds. Now the video gets into society's response in much greater depth. I'll mention a few things. Dance macabre, for instance. These are typically images of the dead living with people, doing people things. Usually they're dancing because that's what people do. There's this other really gruesome game that people used to play. It was I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's a cat bludgeoning game. Essentially, you'd find a stray cat, um, and then you tie it to you'd find a post. There we are, post, and you tie the cat to the post, and then uh, participants would tie their hands behind their back, and then they'd have to use their forehead to beat the cat to death without getting too scratched or blinded. Um, that was the game. That's a gruesome game. It's horrible on so many levels. But this is taken as an example of how brutal society had come. That this is a form of entertainment. On a softer note, "Ring Around the Rosie," that nursery rhyme is about the initial signs of plague, the little ring and a dot in the center that represents the buboes that begin to expand from Black Death. So there's that as well that kind of plays its way in. I got the marker out for no reason. There we are. Oh, hold on. It's a ring around the rosy. See, ring around the rosy, and it's got a little dot in the center. It kind of looks like that. And then the Black Death expands, and it usually expands your lymph nodes, and your lymph nodes get to about golf ball size, sometimes baseball size, and then they turn black. So hence the Black Death. Ring Around the Rosie is supposed to be a nursery rhyme to get kids to recognize the signs and symptoms of Black Death. So when you get sick, to be worried. Okay, the impact of the Black Death. So you've got a loss of between a third, half, some say 2/3. That might be hyperbolic. Come on, let's just fix that. 1/2. Good. So you've got about a half of the population of Europe killed. This led to a demand for labor. So serfs could actually start moving around and leaving their land and going to places where they get better pay. So this is really important change in social order as a result of the Black Death. Um, the employers, so nobles, had to pay more to retain serfs. An example of this is Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So in 1381, there's this big revolt, led by a kind of peasant named Wat Tyler. He's a bit of a folk hero in England. He marched on London. This is during the time when there was a young king. So London or England was just finishing the 100 Years' War. Still in the midst, actually, still in the midst of the 100 Years' War. And there's a young king named Richard II, not to be confused with his more infamous later namesake, Richard III. Richard II great Shakespearean play, by the way, about a guy who is basically pushed around by his nobility for most of his life, decides to take revenge, and it doesn't go well. Anyways, um, Richard II, as a youth, however, had to face the Peasants' Revolt. As a king of 14 years age, he went out and confronted Wat Tyler in the Peasants' Revolt. It looked as though the knights, his knights and soldiers, were going to go to war with the peasants, and that would be a bad thing because you kill your labor, more of your labor gets mad, and then you have a civil war. Richard II dispels this by going out and walking amongst the peasants, demonstrating that he is their king. He's there with them, and so that kind of dispels the revolt. And later, those peasants they do get slightly higher wages and a little bit more lax support from their government. Now, other impacts on social order: the religious orders start to face a pretty big impact from this. Many people, to um, try to solve the plague, they pray. Then you get the extreme version with the flagellants, praying and also self mutilating. And this doesn't get rid of the plague, which leads many people to question the ability of the church to actually solve some of their temporal problems. Um, there's supposed to be stuff on Jan Hus. I guess we're going to go into him the following week. But basically, what this does is it starts this weakening of the religious social order, starts this movement of people questioning the church and its ability to provide stability in Europe. It's pre Black Death. The church is your unifying institution. The Catholic Church essentially replaces the Roman Empire as a unit of governance. The dioceses are organized along the same lines as the old former governorships. Um, so the Black Death really breaks down the power of the church to comfort people and to provide what they need at a time of crisis. So that social order begins to break down. And next week, what we'll do is we'll talk about the High Middle Ages and the power of the church, and then how this breaks it down. We'll also be discussing the High Middle Ages, the Hundred Years' War, the appearance of the Jan Hus and the Husarites, and the beginning of questioning of religious power and authority. And all of this kind of builds to the later movement of the Renaissance. Again, historians debate about when that starts. Some move it into the High Middle Ages, which is why we're going to get into the beginning stages of that. And of course, then you take another course to learn more about that. Okay, this week. Hey, no discussion this week. What you should do is watch the video if you feel comfortable enough to, and do some of the questions for that. Learn about the Black Death. Know that it's incredibly important, because it is. You can work on the discussion portfolio, or you can begin the museum podcast assignment. It technically doesn't have to start this week because there's only 3 sections to it, but you can if you want. Okay. That was longer than expected, so I'm going to sign out here. Watch the video, enjoy, and take care. Bye.